If my son dies tonight, every doctor in this building will wish they had never walked into this hospital," Victor Romano said quietly. And somehow that calm voice was more terrifying than a shout as the ICU monitors blinked in uneven rhythms and the late-night staff froze mid-step under the fluorescent lights of St. Augustine Medical Center in downtown Chicago, where it was 2:17 a.m. and the tension in the air felt thick enough to slow breathing itself. Ethan Romano lay motionless beneath a web of wires and monitors, his skin pale, his breathing shallow, while 3 attending physicians stood at the foot of the bed flipping through charts that offered no answers, and outside the glass doors more specialists gathered, cardiologists, neurologists, infectious disease experts, some flown in from New York, others driven in from neighboring states, all summoned by a single call that traveled faster than protocol, faster than paperwork, because everyone knew who Victor Romano was, and no one wanted to be the one who failed him. Dr. Michael Carter rubbed his temples, glancing at the heart rate monitor that dipped again before stabilizing. "We've run every panel," he muttered, his voice tight, while a nurse adjusted an 4-bag measured in milliliters, her hands steady even though her eyes flicked toward the silent man standing at the corner of the room. Victor Romano dressed in a charcoal suit that looked untouched by the long night, his expression unreadable, his presence filling the ICU without movement, as 2 private security personnel stood quietly near the hallway entrance, not blocking anyone, but making it clear that no one was leaving until answers came. The overhead clock ticked louder than usual, or maybe everyone just noticed it more, because every second that passed made the situation heavier. And when another specialist stepped forward to suggest a rare autoimmune disorder, Dr. Carter shook his head. "Already ruled out," he said, flipping to another page. While Ethan's oxygen saturation dipped again, and the monitor issued a soft warning tone that made a young resident swallow hard, because none of this made sense. No trauma, no infection, no neurological event, no clear explanation. Just a healthy 14-year-old boy who collapsed at dinner 6 hours earlier and never fully regained consciousness. Outside the room, nurses whispered quietly, their voices barely above the hum of machines, while down the hallway a janitor pushed a quiet floor buffer past the nurse's station, his movements slow and deliberate, unnoticed by almost everyone. Daniel Brooks wore a Navy maintenance uniform and simple sneakers, his badge clipped to his chest, his eyes briefly glancing toward the ICU doors as he passed, then returning to his work without urgency, because in a hospital at this hour, invisible was normal, and Daniel had long ago learned how to exist without drawing attention. Inside the ICU, another specialist cleared his throat and began listing possible toxic exposures, but the labs were clean, and the silence that followed stretched long enough for Victor Romano to finally step forward, not aggressively, not loudly, just one measured step closer to the bed where his son lay, his voice low but unmistakable. "You told me you were the best," he said, not accusing, not threatening, just stating a fact that landed heavier than anything else in the room. And no one responded because there was nothing to say. While down the hallway the floor buffer stopped, Daniel Brooks paused, his head slightly tilted as if listening, the distant sound of the monitor echoing faintly beyond the doors, and for just a moment, he didn't move at all. The hallway outside the intensive care unit remained unusually quiet as Daniel Brooks slowly resumed pushing the floor buffer forward, but his attention stayed fixed on the faint rhythm of the monitor echoing through the glass doors. And although most people in the hospital had learned to ignore those sounds, Daniel listened carefully, his eyes narrowing slightly as he passed the nurse's station, where 2 nurses whispered about the case that had already spread across the building, one of them shaking her head and saying they had never seen anything like it, while the other quietly mentioned that more specialists were still arriving from O'Hare International Airport. And inside the intensive care unit the tension tightened as Dr. Michael Carter reviewed the chart again, flipping through pages filled with normal lab values that only made the situation more confusing. Ethan Romano remained still under the glow of overhead lights, his breathing shallow but steady, while a neurologist from Cleveland leaned closer to examine pupil response, and then stepped back with uncertainty. The silence that followed made the machines sound louder, and Victor Romano stood at the foot of the bed watching every movement, his expression calm but heavy, like a man calculating time instead of minutes. And when the heart monitor dipped again slightly, A nurse adjusted the intravenous line measured in milliliters per hour, her hands steady though her eyes flicked toward Victor for just a second. Because everyone felt the pressure even without words, Dr. Carter cleared his throat and spoke carefully, explaining that they were considering a rare metabolic disorder, but that additional blood tests would take time. And Victor Romano nodded once, not impatient, not angry, just absorbing the information in silence, which somehow made the atmosphere even more intense. Outside in the hallway, Daniel slowed again as a young nurse hurried past him carrying fresh lab reports. She almost bumped into his buffer and apologized quickly, but Daniel barely reacted, his focus drawn again toward the glass doors where he could see the blur of movement inside. And something about the timing of the monitor dips seemed familiar, like a pattern just out of reach, and he leaned the buffer against the wall for a moment, pretending to adjust the cord while he listened more carefully. Inside the intensive care unit, another specialist suggested toxic exposure, but the toxicology screen had already returned negative, and Dr. Carter shook his head, frustration building as each possibility disappeared. The overhead clock read 2:34 a.m. now, and the night shift felt longer than usual. Victor Romano finally stepped closer to the bed again, his voice low and measured as he asked how much time they had. And Dr. Carter hesitated before answering honestly that they did not know. That uncertainty settled across the room like a heavy blanket. And in the hallway, Daniel Brooks exhaled slowly, his eyes drifting to the chart screen visible through the glass. He could not read the numbers from that distance, but he watched the rhythm, the pattern, the subtle changes that most people overlooked. And after a long moment, he pushed the buffer aside completely and picked up a simple mop instead, moving closer to the ICU doors with quiet steps, unnoticed by the staff who rushed past him. And as he cleaned the floor just outside the glass, he tilted his head slightly again, listening to the rhythm of the machines, the whispered discussions, and something in his expression shifted, not alarm, not fear, but recognition, as if a memory had quietly surfaced from somewhere deep. And inside the room, another doctor admitted softly that they were running out of options, and for the first time Victor Romano's gaze lifted from his son and moved slowly across the room, measuring each face, each silent hesitation, and just beyond the glass, Daniel Brooks paused mid-motion, gripping the mop handle lightly as the realization settled quietly into place. The realization settled quietly in Daniel Brooks' mind as he listened to the rhythm of the monitor again. The subtle dip followed by a delayed recovery, then a second softer fluctuation that repeated every few minutes. And he glanced through the glass doors where the specialists continued debating, their voices calm but strained as they cycled through possibilities that led nowhere. Inside the intensive care unit, Dr. Michael Carter reviewed another set of lab results while a cardiologist adjusted the bedside monitor settings. Ethan Romano remained still beneath the glow of the overhead lights, his breathing steady but fragile, and Victor Romano stood motionless beside the bed, his presence quiet but heavy, watching each movement with the patience of someone who understood time differently. The overhead clock shifted to 2:41 a.m., and the night seemed to stretch longer. A young resident spoke, cautiously suggesting another neurological scan, but Dr. Carter shook his head again, explaining they had already ruled out seizures and structural abnormalities. Frustration began to creep into the room, though no one raised their voice, because every person there understood the weight of the situation. Outside the glass, Daniel slowly moved the mop across the polished floor, his movements deliberate, but his attention fixed on the pattern he could not ignore. Something about the timing reminded him of a case he had seen years ago, a rare presentation that did not follow typical symptoms, and he leaned slightly closer to the glass, not enough to attract attention, just enough to watch the monitor again. Inside the ICU, another specialist from Boston stepped forward suggesting an unusual electrolyte imbalance, but the numbers did not support it, and the silence that followed stretched longer this time. Victor Romano shifted his gaze from one doctor to another, not demanding answers, just waiting, which made the tension heavier than any threat could have. A nurse adjusted the intravenous flow rate measured in milliliters per hour, checking the tubing carefully, and Ethan's breathing changed slightly, subtle but noticeable to those watching closely. Dr. Carter leaned forward, then straightened again when nothing progressed. Outside the room, Daniel Brooks paused again, gripping the mop handle lightly as the memory sharpened. He remembered the delayed response, the normal labs, the confusion among specialists, and he felt the quiet certainty building, not sudden, not dramatic, just steady recognition. A nurse passed him carrying fresh printouts, barely noticing him as she entered the room, and Daniel watched as she handed them to Dr. Carter, who scanned them quickly before lowering the pages, the frustration in his expression deeper now. The overhead lights hummed softly, and the hallway felt unusually still. Daniel took a slow breath, his eyes returning to the monitor. The pattern repeated again, subtle but undeniable, and something in his posture shifted, not urgency but decision. He set the mop aside against the wall, wiping his hands quietly on a folded cloth, then stepped slightly closer to the glass doors, still unnoticed by the busy staff inside the room. Another doctor admitted softly that they were running out of ideas, and Victor Romano finally spoke again, his voice calm but firm as he asked what they were missing. No one answered immediately, and outside the glass Daniel Brooks looked at the monitor once more, the rhythm steady in its irregularity, and he felt the quiet certainty settle fully into place. As if a puzzle had completed itself, he glanced down the hallway, then back toward the ICU, and after a brief pause he stepped forward one slow step closer to the door, his expression calm, his voice still silent, but the decision already made. Daniel Brooks stopped just outside the glass doors of the intensive care unit, his hand resting lightly on the mop handle as he watched the monitor dip again, the rhythm steady in its irregularity, and for a moment he hesitated, not because he doubted what he was seeing, but because he understood how it would sound coming from him. A janitor stepping into a room filled with some of the most respected physicians in the country. Inside the ICU, Dr. Michael Carter lowered another chart onto the counter, his shoulders tight with exhaustion. The overhead clock now reading 2:48 a.m., while the specialists stood in small clusters quietly discussing possibilities that all seemed to fade before they formed. Ethan Romano remained still, the soft beeping of the monitor marking time that felt increasingly fragile. Victor Romano stood near the bed with his hands loosely folded, his calm presence drawing attention without movement. And when the oxygen level dipped slightly again, a nurse adjusted the intravenous line, glancing toward Dr. Carter, who nodded but offered no new direction. Outside the glass, Daniel exhaled slowly, then set the mop carefully against the wall, wiping his hands on the cloth at his belt, his steps quiet as he moved toward the door, unnoticed by most of the staff moving quickly through the hallway. He paused once more as if confirming the pattern in his mind, then gently pushed the door open just enough to step inside. The room barely reacted at first. A janitor entering a hospital room was not unusual, and Daniel moved quietly toward the far corner, careful not to interrupt. But as he glanced at the monitor again, the certainty settled deeper, and he shifted slightly closer, still silent. Dr. Carter continued reviewing notes with the neurologist, explaining that they were running out of immediate options, while another specialist suggested waiting for additional lab results. Victor Romano listened without expression, his gaze steady on his son. The silence stretched again, and Daniel Brooks finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear, almost hesitant yet steady. "Excuse me," he said softly, and the single word seemed to pause the room. A few heads turned slowly toward him, surprised but not yet annoyed. Dr. Carter looked up briefly, expecting a routine question, but Daniel's eyes remained fixed on the monitor, and he added quietly, "I think I have seen this before." The words hung in the air for a moment, unexpected and out of place. The neurologist blinked in confusion, and one of the residents shifted slightly, unsure whether to respond. Dr. Carter frowned gently, not dismissive but puzzled, as if trying to understand why a janitor would step forward now. Victor Romano's gaze moved from the bed to Daniel, calm but attentive, and the room fell into a brief silence, broken only by the steady hum of machines. Daniel did not move closer, did not raise his voice. He simply looked at the monitor and then back at Ethan, his expression calm, almost reflective, as if he were recalling something from memory, and the quiet confidence in his posture made the moment linger longer than expected. Dr. Carter finally spoke, carefully. "What do you mean you have seen this before?" And Daniel Brooks answered softly, "The pattern, it is not random." His voice still calm, still respectful, but something about the certainty in his tone made the room shift slightly. The specialists exchanged brief glances, and Victor Romano stepped one small pace closer, his attention now fully on the janitor who had just spoken. The room remained still for a moment after Daniel Brooks spoke, the quiet confidence in his voice lingering in the air while the specialists exchanged uncertain glances. Dr. Michael Carter stepped slightly closer, his expression measured but cautious as he studied the janitor more carefully. "What pattern are you seeing?" he asked, his tone calm but skeptical. Daniel did not immediately answer. Instead, he looked again at the monitor where Ethan Romano's heart rate dipped subtly before, stabilizing again, the timing consistent, the rhythm almost hidden beneath normal fluctuations, and Daniel spoke softly. "It is the delay," he said, his voice steady. "The heart rate dips first, then the breathing shifts, then everything stabilizes again. It repeats every few minutes." The neurologist frowned slightly, glancing at the screen, and one of the residents quickly pulled up the monitor history, scrolling through the past 30 minutes. And as the numbers aligned, the pattern began to reveal itself, subtle but present. Dr. Carter leaned forward, his brow tightening as he followed the timestamps. "That could still be coincidental," he said carefully, though his tone had softened. Daniel nodded slightly, respectful. "It could, unless it matches the other signs," he replied, and Victor Romano stepped closer now, his attention fixed entirely on Daniel, the calm intensity in his gaze making the room feel smaller. "What other signs?" Victor asked quietly. Daniel glanced toward Ethan, then toward the chart screen. He collapsed suddenly. "Normal labs. No infection, no structural findings, but the delayed response suggests something interfering with signaling, not damage, interference." The cardiologist exchanged a look with Dr. Carter, and the neurologist tilted his head slightly, considering the possibility. The silence stretched again as the machines hummed softly, and Daniel continued carefully. "I saw something similar years ago. Rare, difficult to detect early. Does not show in standard tests." Dr. Carter folded his arms slightly, not dismissive but cautious. "And what do you think it is?" he asked. Daniel hesitated briefly, not out of uncertainty, but out of respect for the room filled with experts. Metabolic signaling disorder. Possibly triggered by an enzyme imbalance," he said quietly. The neurologist blinked, and the cardiologist stepped closer to the screen, reviewing the numbers again. Victor Romano remained silent, his gaze steady, the tension in the room shifting from skepticism to curiosity. One of the residents quickly searched the database, pulling up rare conditions, and after a moment he looked up. "There is one. Extremely rare. Fits the delayed pattern," he said cautiously. Dr. Carter leaned closer, reading the description, his expression changing slightly, the possibility aligning with the symptoms they could not explain. Daniel remained still, not stepping forward, not claiming certainty, just standing quietly as the room processed the suggestion, and Victor Romano finally spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "If he is right, what do we do?" The question settled heavily across the room. Dr. Carter glanced at the neurologist, then back at the chart, and for the first time since the night began, the uncertainty shifted into something else. Not yet confidence, but direction, and Daniel Brooks stood quietly at the edge of the room, his eyes still on the monitor as the pattern repeated once more, steady and unmistakable. The room shifted from curiosity to cautious urgency as Dr. Michael Carter straightened and looked again at the data scrolling across the monitor, the rare metabolic signaling disorder now sitting quietly among their possibilities, no longer dismissed, but not yet confirmed. The neurologist leaned forward reviewing the medical database displayed on the tablet, reading the symptoms carefully while the cardiologist compared the timing of Ethan Romano's fluctuations. The overhead clock now read 2:56 a.m., and the night seemed to tighten around them as time moved forward. Victor Romano remained silent but attentive, his gaze moving between the doctors and Daniel Brooks, who still stood near the edge of the room, calm and unobtrusive, as if he had already returned to being invisible. Dr. Carter spoke quietly to the team, explaining that if the disorder was correct, the standard labs would not detect it, and the delayed fluctuations made sense. The neurologist nodded slowly, adding that the condition required a targeted enzyme test rarely performed in emergency situations. A resident quickly moved toward the workstation to request the specialized test, his fingers moving faster now as the room gained direction, and the nurse adjusted the intravenous line again. watching the monitor closely as the pattern repeated, subtle but unmistakable. Daniel glanced briefly at the screen, then lowered his eyes, his posture unchanged. Victor Romano finally spoke again, his voice calm but focused. "How long?" he asked, and Dr. Carter answered carefully that confirmation could take time. But if they believed the diagnosis, they could begin a supportive intervention immediately. The cardiologist nodded, suggesting a controlled adjustment to stabilize the signaling imbalance. The neurologist agreed cautiously, and the team moved quietly into coordinated action. One nurse prepared the medication measured carefully in milligrams. Another monitored Ethan's breathing. The resident double-checked the dosage before handing it to Dr. Carter, who paused for a brief moment, then nodded once. The medication was introduced slowly, and the room watched the monitor together. The seconds stretched longer than before. The machines hummed softly, and the heart rate dipped again, then stabilized, then dipped slightly less, the pattern beginning to soften. The neurologist leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as he watched the rhythm change. Dr. Carter exhaled quietly, not relief yet, but cautious optimism. Victor Romano remained still, his attention fixed on the monitor. The silence filled the room again as the next cycle approached, and when the fluctuation returned, it was smaller this time, subtle but noticeable. The nurse glanced at Dr. Carter, who nodded slightly, and the cardiologist stepped closer, whispering that the response was consistent with their theory. Daniel Brooks watched quietly from the edge, his expression calm, as if he expected the shift, and after another minute the breathing pattern stabilized further, the monitor now showing steadier readings. Dr. Carter finally allowed a small breath of relief, still cautious but encouraged. Victor Romano looked briefly toward Daniel, then back at his son, the tension in the room easing slightly for the first time since. The night began, and as the monitor continued to steady, the specialists exchanged quiet glances, the uncertainty giving way to something stronger, direction turning into possibility, and Daniel Brooks remained silent, standing quietly near the door as the pattern that once seemed random slowly began to fade. The monitor stabilized further as the minutes passed, each cycle becoming smoother than the last, and the tension that had filled the intensive care unit slowly loosened. Though no one allowed themselves to relax completely, Dr. Michael Carter kept his eyes fixed on the readings, watching carefully for any sudden change. The neurologist stood beside him quietly comparing the numbers, and the cardiologist leaned closer to observe the rhythm now settling into a more predictable pattern. Ethan Romano breathing appeared steadier, subtle but encouraging, and a nurse carefully adjusted the intravenous flow again, her movements precise and calm. The overhead clock shifted to 3:07 a.m., and the long night seemed to move forward with cautious hope. Victor Romano remained beside the bed, his gaze steady on his son, his posture unchanged, but something in his expression softened slightly, as if the weight he carried had shifted just enough to breathe. The resident at the workstation turned back toward Dr. Carter, explaining that the specialized enzyme test had been expedited and results would arrive soon. Dr. Carter nodded quietly, his attention still on the monitor, and when the next cycle passed without the previous dip, the neurologist exchanged a brief glance with him, the silence in the room now filled with quiet anticipation. Instead of uncertainty, Daniel Brooks stood near the door, still and unobtrusive, his eyes briefly moving from the monitor to the team, then back again, as if confirming the steady change. Another minute passed, then another, and Ethan breathing deepened slightly, subtle but visible. The nurse noticed first, then Dr. Carter leaned forward, watching closely. The cardiologist nodded slowly, whispering that the response was consistent with stabilization. Victor Romano finally stepped closer to the bed, his eyes fixed on his son's face, and for the first time since the night began, he spoke softly, asking if he was improving. Dr. Carter answered carefully that the signs were positive, still early but encouraging, and the room seemed to exhale together, the tension easing into cautious relief. At that moment the resident received the preliminary test results, his eyes widening slightly as he scanned the screen. He turned toward Dr. Carter, his voice low but clear, confirming that the enzyme imbalance matched the suspected condition. The neurologist leaned in to review, then nodded once, and Dr. Carter allowed himself a quiet breath of certainty. The diagnosis was no longer a theory. Victor Romano looked from the doctors to Daniel Brooks, the connection now undeniable, and he stepped slowly toward him, the room noticing the movement, the quiet janitor now at the center of attention. Victor Romano's voice remained calm, but carried weight. "You saw it before anyone else," he said, not as a question, but as recognition. Daniel nodded slightly, his expression modest. The pattern was there. He replied softly. The specialists exchanged glances, their skepticism replaced by respect, and Dr. Carter stepped forward, his tone sincere, asking Daniel how he recognized something so rare. Daniel hesitated briefly, not uncomfortable, just thoughtful, then answered quietly, "I used to study cases like this." His words simple but unexpected, and the room fell silent again, the weight of that sentence. Settling slowly, Victor Romano studied him for a moment, then glanced back at his son, whose breathing now appeared calmer, the monitor steady, the crisis slowly dissolving into recovery, and Daniel Brooks remained standing quietly near the door, the invisible janitor no longer invisible at all. The silence that followed Daniel Brooks' quiet admission settled heavily across the intensive care unit as the specialists exchanged thoughtful glances, the weight of his words lingering in the air. Dr. Michael Carter studied him more closely now, no longer seeing just a janitor, but someone who recognized a rare condition faster than an entire team of experts. The monitors continued their steady rhythm beside Ethan Romano, the breathing now deeper and more stable, and the nurse recorded the improved readings carefully, her movements calm but purposeful. Victor Romano remained still for a moment, then stepped slightly closer to Daniel, his presence quiet but commanding. "You studied medicine," he said, his tone calm but certain. Daniel hesitated briefly, then nodded once. "A long time ago," he replied softly. The neurologist leaned forward, curiosity replacing skepticism, and Dr. Carter asked gently where he had trained. Daniel looked briefly toward the floor before answering. "Johns Hopkins residency in internal medicine." The room fell silent again, the name carrying weight among the physicians. The resident near the workstation blinked in surprise, and the cardiologist shifted slightly, clearly reassessing the quiet man standing near the door. Victor Romano's gaze sharpened slightly, not suspicious, but attentive. "Then why are you here?" he asked quietly. Daniel paused for a moment, then answered simply, "Life changes." His voice calm, not defensive, not detailed, just honest. The silence returned as the team processed the unexpected revelation. The monitors continued steady, Ethan breathing stronger now. The nurse adjusted the oxygen level slightly, and Dr. Carter turned back toward the readings, his expression now carrying cautious relief. The resident received another update confirming the stabilization trend, and the neurologist nodded. Slowly, acknowledging the progress, Victor Romano looked again at his son, then back at Daniel, and for the first time his expression softened visibly. "You saved him," he said quietly. Daniel shook his head slightly. "The team did," he replied, but Dr. Carter spoke firmly. "You gave us direction." His tone sincere, the specialists nodded in agreement. The room now filled with quiet respect. Another minute passed, and Ethan's fingers moved slightly beneath the blanket, subtle but unmistakable. The nurse noticed first and leaned forward, calling Dr. Carter's attention. Victor Romano stepped closer instantly, his eyes fixed on the movement, and as Ethan's breathing deepened again, the neurologist confirmed that the response was consistent with recovery. The tension that had filled the room finally began to dissolve into relief. Victor Romano exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing for the first time, and he turned once more toward Daniel Brooks, the quiet janitor who had shifted the entire night. And as the monitors continued their steady rhythm, Daniel remained standing near the door, calm and composed, as if he had never stepped forward at all. The room now fully aware that the man they almost overlooked had just changed everything. The steady rhythm of the monitor filled the intensive care unit as the tension finally gave way to quiet relief. Ethan Romano breathing stronger now, his chest rising more naturally with each passing minute. The nurse carefully noted the improving vitals, while Dr. Michael Carter reviewed the stabilization trend. The neurologist confirmed that the enzyme imbalance was responding exactly as expected, and the cardiologist stepped back slightly, allowing the moment to settle. Victor Romano remained beside the bed, his eyes fixed on his son, and when Ethan's fingers moved again, slightly stronger this time, Victor exhaled slowly, the weight that had followed him into the hospital finally beginning to lift. The overhead clock read 3:22 a.m., and the long night that had seemed endless now felt different, calmer, controlled. Victor turned slowly toward Daniel Brooks, who still stood quietly near the door, his posture unchanged, his expression calm, and Victor stepped closer, the room naturally parting as he moved. "You recognize something 100 doctors could not," he said quietly, not as praise but as acknowledgement. Daniel shook his head gently. "I just noticed the pattern," he replied softly, but Victor studied him carefully, understanding that quiet confidence. Dr. Carter stepped forward, his tone respectful now, asking Daniel if he had ever considered returning to medicine. Daniel paused briefly, then answered simply, "I never really left. I just stopped practicing." The specialists exchanged thoughtful glances, the room filled with a quiet respect that had not existed earlier. Victor Romano looked back at his son once more, then returned his gaze to Daniel, his voice calm but firm. "You do not belong cleaning floors," he said, the words measured. Daniel gave a small, modest smile, not embarrassed, not proud, just acknowledging the moment. Dr. Carter nodded in agreement, adding that talent like Daniel's should not remain hidden. The nurse adjusted Ethan's blanket gently as his breathing deepened further. The neurologist confirmed that recovery signs were now consistent, and the tension that once filled the room had completely transformed into relief. Victor Romano extended his hand slowly toward Daniel, the gesture simple but meaningful. Daniel hesitated for a moment, then shook his hand respectfully. Victor's voice softened slightly as he spoke again. "You did not just help my son, you gave him his future back." Daniel nodded quietly, then glanced toward the monitor one last time, confirming the steady rhythm, and he stepped back toward the door, returning to the quiet space where he had stood before. The specialists watched him with new understanding, no longer seeing a janitor, but someone who carried knowledge shaped by experience. As Daniel picked up the mop handle he had left beside the wall, the moment felt almost surreal. The same man who had quietly entered the room, now leaving just as quietly. But everything had changed. Victor Romano looked once more at his son, then toward Daniel walking into the hallway. And in the soft hum of machines and the calm of early morning, one truth lingered in the room. Sometimes the quietest voice carries the greatest clarity, and the man no one noticed had just rewritten the night.